As you will have already gathered, Bill didn't drown. He managed to clamber into the last of the lifeboats and was rescued by a passing frigate, but only after making his first vital contribution to the war effort on active service. It was his job to send out the distress signal. After the outbreak of war with Germany, the Littlejohn family, Bill Sr., Min, young Bill and younger brother Ken, was evacuated to Fairley on the west coast of Scotland. Bill Sr. was a stevedore at the Royal Docks on the River Thames in London and was seconded to the naval dockyard at Fairley, which has a sheltered harbour and was home to the anti-submarine experimental establishment during the Second World War. The transfer may well have been fixed by Min's youngest brother, Walter French, who had been the Royal Navy's chief engineering artificer. During the Second World War, he was recalled to the reserve and posted to the RN test laboratories at Teddington, where he was in charge of the tanks used to develop Barnes-Wallis's famous bouncing bombs, which were employed with such devastating effect in the Dambusters raids. Being transplanted from East London to the Scottish seaside must have been a rude awakening for the Littlejohns. Young Bill was bored silly, but soon found himself a profitable sideline, shipping fresh Scottish seafood by rail back to a neighbour in Vine Gardens who had a stall on Billingsgate Market. Skate was especially plentiful in the waters of the west of Scotland, and was in great demand in London, where it had been in short supply since the beginning of the war. Bill would buy it off the local fisherman, box it up, and his neighbour would meet the cargo off the train at Euston. The enterprise kept Bill sane and in pocket money until he was old enough to join up. Fried skate wing would become his favourite fish for the rest of his life. He'd even eat the bones. Although life in Fairley was safer than in East London, which was coming under regular bombardment from the Luftwaffe, the Littlejohns never really settled in Scotland. They had rarely ventured further than Clacton and Southend on the Essex coast, even though they were one of the first families in Vine Gardens to own a car. Their end of terrace house stood out from the rest by virtue of its garage. Stevedores, who worked on the ships unloading cargoes, considered themselves a cut above mere dock labourers. They had their own union, the NAS&D, known as the Blues, named after the colour of their membership cards, to distinguish themselves from their bitter rivals the Whites in the much larger TGWU. To reflect this enhanced status, Bill Sr. bought himself a Wolsey, an exclusive mark usually associated with middle-class doctors and solicitors, not hairy-arse manual workers, which he later traded in for a brand-new Ford 8. But dock work was arduous, dangerous, and involved long and what we would call today antisocial hours. Stevedore's pay reflected that, and the Littlejohns lived well, by the standards of the 1930s working class. They owned their own home in leafy Ilford, then a distinctive town in its own right, before metropolitan sprawl turned the eastern fringes of Essex into part of suburban Greater London. Their exodus from the East End to Essex, from the inner city to the suburbs, was the beginning of a trend which began in the late 1920s, accelerated after the war and continues to this day. The Littlejohns were part of the aspirant working class determined to get up, get on and get out. Half a century later, these were the kind of people, the so-called C2s in marketing speak, who had once supported Labour but who switched to Mrs Thatcher and the Conservatives in search of a more affluent tomorrow. In 1987, the Labour leader Neil Kinnock made a speech to his party's conference in which he tried to explain the reasons for Labour's third successive defeat at the handbag of Mrs Thatcher. Adopting a cod Cockney accent intended to mimic the then TGWU General Secretary Ron Todd, Kinnock posed a rhetorical question which nailed the failure of Labour's clapped-out collectivist model. Would you say to a docker who earns £400 a week, owns his own house, a new car, a microwave, as well as a small place near Marbella? You do not say, he continued, brother, let me take you out of your misery. OK, so in the 1930s, microwave ovens hadn't been invented.